So hello, welcome. I'm very happy to be here today to talk to Joanne Limburg about her book, Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism and Feminism, which was published earlier this year by Atlantic Books. So I'm just going to say a bit more about Joanne if you've not had a chance to meet her before. Her previous publications include, in non-fiction, Small Pieces, a book of lamentations, The Woman Who Thought Too Much, a memoir of obsession and compulsion. A fiction book includes A Want of Kindness, a novel of Queen Anne. And she has 3 poetry collections, including The Autistic Alice, Paraphernalia, and Feminismo. So without further ado, if you're ready, Joanne, we would love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Fergus, and thank you all of you for being here. I'm going to read a bit from this book before I talk to Anna. As you know, it's called Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism and Feminism, and it's a series of letters written to women in the past who may now have been given an autism diagnosis, but to avoid diagnosing people posthumously, which you really shouldn't do. I just think of them as weird sisters. So these are weird women. So one of them is Virginia Woolf. One of them is Deline Block, who was one of the victims of the Nazi program of, well, murdering disabled people, basically, T4. It was a eugenics program of the nastiest kind. Third letter is to Frau V, who was one of the parents of one of Asperger's patients that he wrote about in his very significant paper, and who seems to have been pretty weird herself, just from his thumbnail description of her. And the fourth one, which I'm going to read from, is to Katharina Kepler, who was the mother of Johannes Kepler, and we know so much about her because he defended her in a witch trial. And in my letter to Katharina, I'm thinking about all the books are about, all the different letters are about ways in which one might fail to be normatively female. And Katharina was blunt and straightforward and logical and didn't go in for crying or simpering or anything that might have helped her not to get accused of witchcraft. And in this bit, I talk about how I learned over years to compensate and to camouflage, mask, whatever word you like to do, and soften myself. And I talk about the creation of this persona called SGJ, Socially Gracious Joanne. So, SGJ is middle class. SGJ is white. SGJ can pass for neurotypical. The protection she affords would not be available to me if I were unable to speak or to suppress the characteristics which mark me out as other. In a post on their blog, Cussin' and Discussin', Mel Baggs explained that in a society which judges people by their ability to conform to an emotionally muffled, verbally indirect, distinctly middle-class mode of relating, people with developmental disabilities must always be at a terrible disadvantage, and this is Mel Baggs speaking now. People with developmental disabilities may find it harder to pretend we are feeling something we are not. We may find it harder to detach ourselves from what we are feeling. We might find it harder to act as if we don't notice something that is happening. We are sometimes more direct or blunt in our communication styles than usual. We might find it hard to act like someone is our social better, even if we are trying to be respectful. We might find it hard to speak indirectly or abstractly about something we are feeling right now. We might find it hard to speak at all if we are feeling strongly and may communicate through other means. We might find it hard to pretend we perceive the world differently than we do. We might find it hard to be abstract about something that's very concrete to us. Sorry, the dog. This is a passage from Post entitled Nice Lady Therapists and Their War Against Human Emotion. The term nice lady therapist was coined by another autistic blogger, Rabbi Ruti Reagan. as a way of describing certain female professionals who harm the children they are supposed to be helping, who inflict invalidation trauma, but do so in ways so subtle and so generally acceptable that they may not even be aware they are doing it themselves. The nice lady therapist will tell their charges that whatever they do to us is by definition nice and good for us, and that we like it, and that they love us, and that they are rescuing us, and that we are grateful. End of quote. They work in brightly coloured therapy rooms, in sessions filled with toys and praise and rewards and smiles, and yet, quote, every interaction with them is degrading in a way that's hard to pinpoint and hard to recover from, close quote. These interactions include treating a child as if they were younger than they are, forcing a child to do something frightening or painful while forbidding them to express pain or fear, as it hurts their feelings to see a child upset. Sometimes it's a matter of being expected to accept intensely bad advice as though it's insight, quote, such as being told that the way to make friends is to try harder with the kids who are rejecting and bullying them. Sometimes it's even touching a child invasively and against their expressed wishes, while telling them it must be for their own good, because by definition, anything the nice lady therapist says is good or does is good and nice and nurturing. When I read these posts by Baggs and Reagan, they chilled me to the bone, not just because I remembered what had sometimes been done to me, but because I saw for the first time exactly who SGJ was trying to be, and that it was not good to be her. SGJ does not respect my experience or my feelings as an autistic person. When I'm being SGJ, I'm treating myself as the little girl playing teacher treats the recalcitrant doll she must move around, speak for, and chastise. She forces me to do and tolerate things that make me uncomfortable, unhappy, and drained, while telling me that she is only acting for my good and for the good of people around me. She tells me that my resistance to her comes from the side of me that must be disavowed, the side that is identified with those other autistics, such as Mel Baggs, whose fate I am privileged, through SGJ's good offices, to escape. SGJ wants me to feel good that I'm not Mel Baggs. She wants me to pity and distance myself from them and other autistic people like them. She wants me to do this even though Baggs' activism has helped me to find myself and to write these very words. SGJ is the personification of my internalized ableism, and as such she perpetuates harm, not only to me, but also to my fellow autistic people who cannot or do not pass as neurotypical, and who do not or cannot let it go when autistic people as a class are harmed or erased or insulted.
Oh, thanks, Joanne. That was brilliant. And I have some questions, and please, to everybody else, don't feel like I should monopolize Joanne and that they're the best questions or the most informed questions, but they're things that relate to things that I've been particularly interested in and moved by in reading Letters to My Weird Sisters and some of Joanne's other work. I think the thing that's coming up most of all now is this idea of a persona that you're writing through in this extract of the socially gracious Joanne. I've noticed that in some of the other works I've been reading recently that this comes up quite a lot, that people are writing non-fiction through a persona who kind of represents some aspects of what seems to me to be, you know, internalized ableism. And I wonder if you think that that maybe relates to issues to do with masking, and if you could explain maybe a bit, if that seems like the right term to describe it.
Oh yes.
Something more complicated.
I think I'm sort of writing in dialogue with socially gracious Joanne at this point, because I've let her take me by the hand and pull me through life. And actually it's time I turned around and had a look at her and said, who are you actually? Do you really mean me well? And who is it that's gone into you and made you up? Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me a bit, and I think we mentioned before that Donna Williams, Polly Samuels is someone that I've found interesting, and maybe it feels a little bit like the way that she writes with and finds eventually unhelpful the characters of Carol and
yes.
Willie.
Yeah, she talks about Carol at some length, doesn't she?
She does.
Yeah, and that Carol starts as someone who protects her and then becomes oppressive. Yeah. you know, smiley, sweet, extrovert Carol.
Yeah.
Who drains her batteries, yeah.
Exactly. Sorry if that's a bit that other people aren't familiar with. It was a memoir that was published in the early 90s originally. I think firstly by, was it an American publisher? But then came to be published by Jessica Kingsley, and it's one of the founding, or perhaps the earliest works of life writing by an openly autistic author. Not the first. I was interested in what you're saying about the ideas of nice and kind as being infantilizing and potentially agency denying for neurodivergent people. I wondered, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that in terms of trying to think about maybe a more neurodivergent friendly ethics, is there another term that would do better? Should we be trying to be kind, or is it just that the way that other people use kind isn't, or nice isn't?
I don't mind kind. I think the word that really gets my goat and does in this chapter is nice. My mother was quite often saying to me, that's not nice. You know, don't sit like that, it isn't nice. Don't say that, it isn't nice. Don't show that, it isn't nice. And it's the nice woman, who pours the tea for Adolf Hitler and keeps the conversation going. I mean, that's a bit extreme, but it's that kind of niceness, that middle-class female niceness, where our role is to sort of smooth everything down, keep everything civil. Yeah, so it's the Tory MP who complains that about the tone of a debate about racism, that why are these people saying these nasty things that make people upset? You see, that's not kind. I mean, kindness doesn't always look nice. Kindness can be quite brusque and quite rude. But yeah, nice. We need to be wary of nice.
I think that's definitely right. It kind of hides the kind of power dynamics, I think, that isn't always.
And it's meant to. I mean, it's the job that specifically white middle-class women like ourselves are given.
Yeah.
And it's how we exercise soft power, and it's how nice lady therapist exercises her soft power.
It's sort of talking about the book more generally, perhaps. I mean, if people haven't had a chance to read it in full, I definitely recommend it. Which was your favourite letter to write? And perhaps why, do you think?
Oh gosh, well, they're great in different ways, but I think the one that was closest to my heart, and the only one I had to rewrite after submission to the publisher, was the one to Deline Block, because that was really trying to get to the bits of me that identified with this non-speaking, apparently learning disabled woman who was very much, whose life and was talked about entirely in clinical terms, and something that happens often and I talk about, and it sort of comes back to that extract I read in Autism Discourse, that so there's some kind of difference between the likes of you and me, some kind of essential difference, and the people that always come up in sort of these Twitter chats who are, but they're non-verbal, but they're severely autistic, I hate the word, but they're profoundly autistic, but they've got, I've even seen the phrase advanced autism. My son has advanced autism, congratulations. And this insistence that I mustn't identify with them. And I say, you know, screw that. Pity doesn't work, care doesn't work, it's solidarity that's the right thing. And I insist on my solidarity with these people. And it doesn't matter how much they're able to express it back, or how much, for all I know, they may understand it. I'm still offering it to them because they're human beings. And that's the morally right thing to do, and the right thing to do with me, for me too. And so I was very emotional writing that chapter to Deline. I was very emotional because I had to write how she was killed as well.
Yeah.
And we know exactly how she died. And I had to walk her, myself, and the reader through that. And it was extremely upsetting.
You were just saying solidarity is the word, perhaps maybe as opposed to kindness or niceness, certainly in these contexts.
Yes.
Did you find your publisher resisting that in any way?
Not at
Am I allowed to
all.
ask?
Not in the slightest. I mean, they've been working with me for a long time. And yeah, I think I suppose I'm very, you know, it's this privilege, isn't it? You never notice the things that are working, do you? No, I had no pushback from my publisher over that at all.
I imagine that the research was very hard.
Oh, yes, very, especially for that chapter, because I basically had to learn about the whole history in the West, at least, of how people with intellectual disabilities have been treated. And there was a lot of it, and it was hard and it was horrible to see how people were treated. I mean, there were things in every chapter that were horrible.
Yeah. The chapter on Deline Block, did you need to go to any archives? Was it easy?
No, I went online and I found her name in an article about T4 about Jewish children, because though she wasn't actually a child at that point, she was in her early 30s when she was murdered. And because I don't know that I had a name for that chapter originally, and then I had this name. It's always more powerful with a name. So I had Adelheid Block, and I found she's got some extended surviving family who live in Israel, and I got in touch with them to make sure they were okay with me writing about it, and they were. And actually, I think, as I mentioned, I don't know if he's her great half nephew or what the exact relationship is, but he actually works with disabled people in a way that is explicitly designed to recognize their humanity and invite their proactive cooperation work. It's about working with, not about doing to. So it couldn't have been more perfect in a way that, you know, she was kind of remembered in his work. And also he's the sponsor of her Stolpersteiner, that means stumbling stone. So all over Europe there are these stones set into the pavement with names on, and they commemorate Holocaust victims outside the last address they were recorded as living in.
That's such a good idea.
Yeah, and it's a reference to a very horrible folk belief that if you stumble, oh, I've just stumbled over a Jew's grave. And in fact, a lot of Jewish gravestones in history have been broken up and used as pavements. And I should say that I'm Jewish as well, obviously, which is another reason why I identified with Adelheid. Yeah. But I mean, I'm moving off the point, but I was very aware with Virginia Woolf that though she was married to a Jew, or even because she was married to a Jew, she could say some very anti-Semitic things.
Yeah.
And so I wrote to her thinking, well, she might not have liked me. She probably would have said horrible things behind my back. Because she said about her sister-in-law, Leonard's sister, that she had to admit that she was a very clever and accomplished woman. And I say that although I don't like the Jewish voice or the Jewish laugh. I know, Fergus there.
Yeah, the AMASE
laughing my Jewish laugh at that.
Was part of literary culture in a way that is often not recognised in the same way that perhaps it's more recognised now. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting that as a person who is othered in whatever way, these are your stumbling points when you read the literature. And it's very interesting and painful sometimes to read from these positions. And also that Virginia Woolf famously, and she was not unusual in this, mentioned seeing some people with intellectual disabilities walking by a river, being horrified and saying they should be killed. You know, and this is a woman who herself had been, you know, had mental health problems and had been made to feel different and had been hospitalized and had all sorts of things do to her, but she wasn't able to extend her empathy to these people. What they represented to her, I guess, somehow frightened her so much, is the charitable way of looking at it, that she couldn't do it. And I think it's absolutely that made me write the Adelheid Block chapter. It's like,
yes,
yeah, I just think the only morally and physically safe way of keeping everyone in is to say, no, there's not another category of those people. You know, even if there are differences that are measurable, they're never categorical. Because otherwise they can be moved out of sight and we can be used to hide them.
I think a lot of harm has come from this urge to measure people in whatever sense and to quantify groups or to fit people into groups against their will.
Yeah.
And without looking at what effect putting them in that group has had. That side of it doesn't seem to be looked at or even of interest to people. So I've got two more questions really about the book, and I'd really like to invite other people to ask questions. They're more general questions, and it goes back to the question about literary diagnosis, the question of whether it's appropriate to diagnose someone as autistic or whatever other condition through a text. And I know that there are other books that do that, as in that claim that historical writers have been autistic in a way that is, you know, it's kind of connected very much to the medical discourses.
Mm.
And I know in the book that you're quite careful to say, well, I'm not diagnosing people. I'm just saying that they describe an experience that is one that I can relate to as an autistic person. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Has it changed over time? I mean, I certainly find an urge in myself to say that certain historical authors were autistic. One in particular who I love, and I'd love to be able to claim them as part of my story for myself.
And I know exactly what you mean. And I mentioned in the chat, I sort of engage with this in the letter to Virginia Woolf, and I say, well, there's a need for community, and I don't see it as any different from genderqueer people, you know, identifying with Anne Lister, for example, you know, the Gentleman Jack. I mean, there she is in history to give you some antecedents and to give you some families and what's the phrase? Is it chosen family that people talk about? Their chosen family or their logical family, I think. So it's about, you know, establishing family and community around you. And I don't actually think you need to, and I'm all about, you know, not respecting these particular kinds of power. So I don't feel any need or desire to go to the medical community and say, do I have this right? Thank you. Is this a real piece of knowledge? Can you give me a certificate, please? Can you give me a stamp? You know, I feel no need to it. You know, if there are all these people in history, and if I want to identify with them, I can. And if I don't, I won't. And
but it's interesting in the way of writing about them. It's slightly different in that you have gone to the families and said, you know, are you okay for me to include this person in the book?
Yes, in the case where there was a lot where the person did have surviving family, and any of the people I mentioned who are alive, you know, people like Freya Haraldsdottir, who's not autistic but who has osteogenesis imperfecta, and who I mentioned, I made sure she was okay with me being in the book, and I made sure that someone who knew Mel Baggs very well was okay with how I'd spoken about her, and so on and so forth, because it was very important to me to respect people. And I think I said in the introduction as well, which is the one letter that's written to the reader, that there was one writer I've always identified with, but I know that her family were on record as not being very happy when people say that she was autistic. So out of respect for them, you know, I kept her out of it. Because however I feel about it, you know, she was their aunt, not mine.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we were going to suggest that, you know, it might be interesting to hear, and I'm certainly willing to say who my letter to my weird sister would be too, if I was to write a letter, if people can think about. But maybe it might be helpful first to think about the word weird and where it's come from, why that word in particular you chose. And I'm sure that other people might have some other thoughts on that word as a way of having an identity. I love the weird sisters in Macbeth.
Yeah,
they're kind of my favorite characters.
I'd almost forgotten about them before I said it, but before I first came up with the title. But I just like weird. I mean, it does have these sort of magical, supernatural connotations, but also it's just a thing that's always thrown at you. Autistic. You're weird. That was weird. You've got a weird look on your face. You said that was a weird thing you said. Why are you moving in that weird way? So, you know, if you can take queer back, as I think Fergus has been doing as well, you can take weird back, can't you? Just say, yeah, I'm weird, cool. And also it has the, it's a word with a lot more give on it in it than autism. It's not got a list of criteria for being allowed to use it. You can feel yourself to be weird. Weirdness is an experience, a particular experience some people have in relation to society, and I think most people don't most of the time. And so you can put yourself in that class and put yourself in that company.
This maybe is a great time to introduce and to start with audience questions. And I think we have one from Fergus. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it, Fergus? He's still formulating it.
Yeah,
I'm happy to read it. Yes, there's a question about the broadness of the term weird. So Mykola recently suggested on Twitter, I kind of want neurodivergent people to reclaim weird the way that gay people reclaim queer. And we've talked about this, like, yes, I think that's kind of what we need to do, but at the same time, it doesn't quite mean neurodivergent.
no.
And I'm quite interested in the ways that it doesn't, and like how it doesn't quite match up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of broader than neurodivergent. I think, I mean, I wouldn't use it as a synonym, because I wouldn't want to leave people out who weren't, if you see what I mean. But it's just, like I said, it's a way of describing a relationship to social norms that you have, and you can be in that awkward relationship or weird relationship in relation to them for a number of reasons.
And to be fair to Mykola's request, he was suggesting that we reclaim it in the same way that gay people reclaim queer, and actually it's not just gay people who are queer. Like,
no, it isn't.
Bisexuals are queer, gendered queer people often see themselves as queer.
Yeah, non-binary people are queer. I mean, it does have that broadness, like the word queerness does, and it does, and so the word in theory has become a way of just questioning norms, you know, to queer something. So to unsettle it. So I think you can weird something in the same way.